Welcome to another Warmaster's Workshop tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to be dyeing this mohair equestrian girth belt to the specific colors that we're looking for, which is kind of a ruddy red. And you've probably seen this, you probably remember this girth belt from earlier tutorials when we did the nylon strapping on the back for connectivity. But yeah, so let's go ahead and get started and get this dyed. So we're going to be using some dye. This is just fabric dye. This is RIT fabric dye. Now, the mohair girth belt that we have is actually quite a bit of synthetic fiber. Now, RIT makes a synthetic specific dye if you want to go with darker colors. I actually want this to dye lighter, so I'm using the all-purpose dye so that it will not take as much dye. It'll be a much lighter color consistency. Now we're going to start this by adding a little bit of dish soap based on the directions of the RIT packaging. It says to add a teaspoon of dish soap, so that's what I'm going to do. Our water here is it's a little over 140 degrees. It's probably close to 160. I'm going to stir that up just a little bit. Now we're also going to use some vinegar, and we need a couple ounces of that. This one of these cups is actually an ounce. So there's one. And you add vinegar to synthetic or to the dye mixture for synthetic fibers. If you're using natural fibers or more natural fibers, you want to use salt instead. Now we're going to add 2.5 ounces of each of these. And this is scarlet, so it's kind of a deep red. So there's 1 ounce. There's 2 ounce. And then we want our 1/2 ounce. Just about right there. So that's 2.5 ounces of the scarlet. Always make sure you put your caps back on your dyes just in case. You don't want to knock them off and have them pour everywhere. Now we're going to go with this is a dark brown. 1. 2. I'm actually going to rinse this out a little bit in there. There we go. So I can see the 1/2. Now I did pre-shake these, so they have been shaken up a little bit already. And let's get our lid back on there. Now I'm just going to stir this up a bit. Kind of looks like a witch's brew. Now while this is hot, I'm just going to completely submerge my girth belt here. And you can see it's already starting to take on some of that nice dye there. I'm going to leave these the nylon straps here kind of out. Not that it'll hurt anything if they get in there, because it won't, but it's just a nice way to be able to pull this girth belt back up out of the dye mixture, and you can see the bubbles going on. It's permeating the fibers and the weave of the fibers. So you're gonna let the girth belt sit in this dye mixture for about 60 minutes, or you can go longer than that if you want. I like checking it periodically just to see how it looks. Sorry for the camera fog, but you can see how nice that looks. That's really nice and almost kind of a blood red, or almost like a crimson color. But we're going to let it sit in there for an hour, keeping it on around medium heat, and we'll come back to it and we'll see how it looks in an hour. So we've had this soaking in for around an hour, and I don't want to fog the camera up too much here, but we still have our nice red going on there. This thing's almost like the color of Boba Fett's girth belt. So what I'm going to do, normally at this point you would take this out and you would let it, you would go ahead and rinse it. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to let it sit in the pot overnight and cool down with the water here. And in doing that, that's actually going to let the hot dye mixture permeate the fibers that much more, and then they're all going to cool down together, and then we're going to rinse everything off, and we're going to see how it looks after it's sat in the pot overnight. Now normally, if you're doing this in a washing machine, you don't want to do that, or you're gonna mess up the inside of your washing machine. If you're doing it in a pot like this, and it's an old pot that you don't care if you do it in, then yes, I would suggest leaving it overnight when it's synthetic fiber like this, just so you give those synthetic fibers enough time to soak up as much of this dye as possible. Because remember, as we said earlier, this dye is really not does not work quite as well for synthetic fibers. So you want to let what's in here color-wise really permeate into those fibers and really stew into those fibers. So we're going to let this sit overnight, and we're going to let it soak up all this nice dye mixture, and then we're going to come back and we're going to rinse it out, and we're going to see how it looks. All right, so we drained our water off of our girth belt, and we let it drip dry outside for about a day. We also wrung it out. It needed to be wrung out. It was really heavy with liquid. So after it has dried, it's fully dried at this point, you can see it's got this nice faded red, sort of almost a faded crimson sort of color. Now what we want to do at this point is we want to add some paint, like a paint wash, to this, to give it sort of a dirty look, other than just the faded look. So what we've got here is we have our acrylic paints that I normally use for paint washes. I'm just going to mix up some dark brown and some, let's shake that up, some off-white or ivory. I don't want to make it too dark, but also don't want it to be too light, otherwise it's not going to show up here on the girth belt. Put a little bit of ivy green in there. We're going to mix this up. So I want it to look, it's actually almost the same color as the dye, so we're going to put a little bit more white in there to lighten it up. Just a little more white. There we go. Whoop. Don't want to splash it all over yourself. There we go. Now that's lighter than the actual girth belt itself. So let me wipe that off, put that to the side. Let me wipe myself off. I'm only wearing one glove because I'm going to be holding the girth belt with this glove while I'm using, or with my gloved hand, while I use my ungloved hand here to apply the paint. And mostly I'm hitting around the lighter areas here, like these. Then this is a nylon rope that they use to bind this thing together. So I'm dirtying that up. And just sort of work your way around it here. You're not really going to see it too much because of the color of the belt. The color of the girth itself is it's very dirt neutral, as I like to say, so you're not going to see a lot of dirt on there. But just sort of splotch it on. You might be able to see it a little bit here. Just sort of splotch it on. You're really going to see it here in this crimson area, or in the lighter crimson area, the almost pink look that the dye has left. Now remember, we didn't use a synthetics only dye. We used a all-purpose dye, which is why this belt looks more faded. And in my opinion, that's kind of what looks the best for this. Now, if you wanted to have a nice, fresh look of paint, unscratched, then I would go with the synthetic, the made-for-synthetic fiber dyes. RIT dye makes a version of that. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but just look at your local fabric store and you'll find it. I'm actually going to set this down. Let me pull the camera down here so you can see a little bit better what I'm doing. See, you're starting to, I don't know if you can see it on the camera. Hopefully you can, but you can kind of see right in here, it's a little bit darker. There's definitely a look of dirt, and that's what we want. We want that look of dirt. Now you may want to wear a glove on your paint application hand. That's totally up to you. See how that looks on the pink here on those nylon straps? They really, on the nylon binding, it really looks good. It looks really nice and dirty. We're getting low on our paint here. I want to have just enough. We'll put a little bit of this on our metal buckles too. We want to dirty those up. And this is just a little sponge applicator. Now one thing you're going to notice, you're going to get some dye on coming off of this thing. You're going to have some dye, and that's going to happen, and I'm going to show you just a quick trick to help reduce that. Now you could wash this. What I did was I rinsed this out with several changes of water, just to get all the dye out. There we go. Now that looks good. One thing we want to do too, before we forget and lose the rest of our paint, here's our two parachute clips. Let's go ahead and get them nice and dirtied up as well. We might have just enough in here for this. I think so. Yeah, there we go. All right, so what we want to do now is we want to make sure that we seal this so that the dye the dye doesn't rub off on your flight suit or your vest or whatever, because dyed material does tend to shed dye. It's just the way it works. So what I'm doing is I'm just using a matte clear enamel. It's just a Rust-Oleum matte clear enamel. We're just going to go over this very lightly and seal this with the enamel. Now make sure you do this in a well-ventilated area. What I did was I used this. This is the front nylon weave line here. I used that to sort of cut this in half for spraying. Got a little metal straggler there. And by the time you're done with one side, this side will be ready to flip. And we're just going to go completely backwards. And let's let that all dry. It actually doesn't take very long for that to dry. It's already dry. And let's go with this side. Just fan it off a little bit here. Yeah, there we go. Now you're probably going to ask, well, how do we test that to make sure that we don't have any dye coming off? I'm just going to take a little bit of water and my finger. Just going to rub it on here and no dye. See, not getting any dye rubbing off. That red is just my finger. So we have sealed up our girth belt at this point. Let's go ahead and put our buckles on. Raise the camera up a little bit. You want to make sure that you put I always like to put the letters on the inside. So let's flip this over. There we go. The clean side is the side that that's going to be on your soft parts. We're just going to go this way. And I just got these at the fabric store. There we go. That one's on nicely. We'll get this one up and through. That one's on nicely as well. Let's go ahead and put the clips on. On the clips, you want to make sure that the hollow side is down. So just like with the other side, there we go. Those are on nice and tight. I'm going to go ahead and clip that together. Same over here. We're going to go up and back down. Clip them together. Do some tests to make sure that's nice and tight. And there you have it. There you have your nice dyed dirtied and sealed mohair girth belt. And you can get these in different sizes. I do have an introduction to girth belts. That's a very early Warmaster's Workshop tutorial from several years ago. Please feel free to check that out. It will give you some ideas on where you can get your girth belts, on what to look for as far as girth belt material, and just gives you some really good insight on the girth belt itself, and even sashes. It talks about using sashes as well. So anyway, I look forward to seeing what kind of girth belt you can come up with. Please feel free to shoot me some pictures on my Facebook page at Mandalore the Uniter. If you enjoy these videos, please feel free to continue to watch, and hopefully they're helping you out. So join us next month in the Warmaster's Workshop as we tackle um, our next armor surprise. And until then, be safe, and we'll see you next month.